Welcome to the Future of Wellness, exploring self-transformation and holistic healing to unlock your inner potential. Hosted by Christabel Armston and Keith Parker.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Future of Wellness. Today we are joined by Dr. Rollin McCraty. Rollin is Director in Research at HeartMath Institute Research Center, a professor at Florida Atlantic University, and a psychophysiologist. One of his primary areas of focus is the physiology of emotion, investigating the mechanisms by which emotions influence cognitive processes, behavior, and health. He's been with HeartMath Institute since its founding by Doc Childre in 1991. Rollin has worked closely with Dr. Childre to develop HMI's research goals and has also been instrumental in developing the HeartMath system of tools and technology to help people relieve stress and break through to greater levels of personal balance, stability, and fulfillment. He is one of the primary creators of the Global Coherence Initiative and the principal designer of the Global Coherence Monitoring, which investigates the relationship between human and geomagnetic field environments and communication among all living systems. His critical research on heart rate variability and heart rhythm coherence has gained international attention in the scientific community and is helping to change long-held perceptions about the heart's role in health, behavior, performance, and quality of life. Rollin, it is such a pleasure to have you on the podcast today.
Great, Keith. Well, thank you. I've got to get a shorter bio.
Well, there's a lot to say. You've covered, a lot in your career. So we're, going to touch into a bunch of that today. Maybe you could share with us kind of how your journey led you to working with the HeartMath Institute.
Oh boy. Let me give a short version of that. Let's see where to start. I've always had a deep sense of curiosity and sense of adventure. And so from a very early age, I was always curious about what is a magnetic field and a gravitation and all these kinds of things, and would often ask professors and so on in my journey. My original career was communication engineer, and would ask, well, what is a field and this kind of thing? And I'd get these mathematical formulas. No, I get that. That describes how it behaves. What is it? And could never get a straight answer to that. It was kind of like, politely brush it off and don't ask that. Really was what was going on. And then I was actually at the University of Nebraska at that time. Would have been in the 1970s, I guess, and ran across a book in the bookstore there that led me to eventually, it was really about consciousness, and some other perspectives on these things in the field of radionics and so on. And that kind of had a resonance with me because it was like hinting at some of the questions I had always had. So I basically moved to California to get a degree in consciousness studies, consciousness research, and one of the first degree granting institutions that, in that field. So through that, I basically did that, and then got involved in with a gentleman in a group that first introduced spirulina to the world, at least to the Western world. And the motive behind all that was to really help feed the world's hungry populations. And it had a true humanitarian motive behind it. And well, long story short, in I think it was early 1980s, National Enquirer, the supermarket magazine, did a front page story on this spirulina stuff. And in the next couple of months, in the company that I was running at that time for this, we sold about $20 million worth of spirulina. Amazing the power of those magazines. Anyway, that's a whole other sub story, but we won't get into how we pulled that off. And so anyway, we took the profits of that and went to the deserts of Southern California to prove that you could grow spirulina and feed the world's hungry populations. And we actually did that, pulled it off way ahead of our time, big giant spray dryers that are all solar powered and so on. And to try and keep this short, that went absolutely nowhere in terms of feeding the world's hungry populations. And it was really blocked. It wasn't the technology, we had it, but the blocks were at the political levels, bureaucracy levels, and you can probably get the idea there. And meanwhile, I've got a degree in consciousness, right? I mean, I know I learned about meditation and all this and so on. And that's in hindsight, I can say that's when my idealism bubble got popped, because, I was talking about consciousness, but it really became very visceral that no, it really is a problem in consciousness, in a kind of new way for me to understand that. And anyway, I said, oh, the heck with this humanitarian stuff. I'm going to make money again. And started a company which became very successful in a fairly short time in electrostatics. That's kind of irrelevant here, but and so that was fun. I'll have to admit, having a rapidly growing, successful company. But there was another part of me that I understand better now, but that was not really fulfilled. And another sports car in the driveway wasn't going to do it. So went through that phase, and then I met Doc Childre, the founder of HeartMath. This was long before HeartMath existed as an organization, and spent some. Actually, he was on the East Coast at that time, and I was back there on business, and said, "I'll go meet this character that I'm hearing about from some mutual friends." Spend an hour, and spent 3 days, and that's when I would say I had a kind of more of a heart awakening, and because I'd learned about the heart, right? I mean, in consciousness, it's all about it, but it was more of a metaphor. So but really had that experience of what the heart really is, more than, and a lot of insights came through that kind of awakening process. So basically, I made more personal progress and gains in the following 3 or 4 months I had in many years of meditation. That, not that I didn't get benefit out of that, but it was a whole different kind of experience. So I sold the company and joined with Doc and some others to help found HeartMath.
I'm intrigued by two things here, actually. One, I just wanted to call back slightly to the bio and this area of focus, the physiology of emotion. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about what is meant by that. And I'm also intrigued there by that apparently very powerful moment that you've just described, that I could sort of sense into there, that heart awakening that you describe, and how seminal that was in your journey.
So on the first I'm officially, I guess, a psychophysiologist that's branched into many other areas since then. But so the physiology of emotions, I mean, we spend a lot of time, and our lab is primarily a psychophysiology lab. And so in the early years, in the early 90s, we spent a lot of time looking at how different emotional states or emotional experiences affect physiology, like a lot of is kind of common, hormones and neurotransmitters and immune functions and so on. And we took a little different tack at it. And so you have to remember, this is the early 90s, right? And at that time, this is many years before the positive psychology movement. And at that time, there were maybe 3 papers I could find in the research literature. It was a very different world back then, too. You actually had to go to libraries to search things out. We didn't have all the internet stuff we do now. And anyway, that's very, very few research studies had been done on positive emotions. I think I found 3 or 4, that were in that world. Hundreds, thousands on stress and depression and, anxiety and so on. But very, very few into positive. So we were looking at things like what happens when people really feel appreciation or compassion, a lot of these things, long before like I said, the curve of that. And we were also looking a little bit deeper at the activity of the heart in those emotional states, but all the standard stuff that you do, brain EEGs and brain and et cetera, et cetera. And so that led to really seeing that heart rate variability. This is before it was actually called heart rate variability. It was certainly not widely known. That was the most reflective of emotional state, which was reflecting the activity in the nervous system that was driven by emotions. And so that led down many paths to understanding why the most reflective of discrete emotional states was reflected in the heart, not brain waves and things like that. That was almost impossible to pull out. And so that started that journey. So now I would say maybe 30 years later that from an emotional perspective, yeah, we can certainly measure changes in biochemistry and hormones and neural activity in the heart, brain, nervous system, and so on. But that there's where I've kind of come to understand now is that emotional experience is a very complex thing with many layers to it, and that we're basically multidimensional beings, that have different vibrational frequencies, that the emotions are ultimately frequencies at the energetic or vibrational level, which are what's driving the activity. It happens there first, and then that results in changes in all the complex stuff and play outs in the nervous system and hormones and so on, which are all part of it. So a lot of our current work is really focused on helping people understand that and how that we can become more in charge of our emotional diet. And if we become more self-aware of the different levels, so self-awareness is many layers. It keeps growing to become who we really are and more vibrational level or energetic level awareness. So it's a lot easier to grab to. I kind of use the metaphor of an inner radio knob, right? Part of our own inner technology, because it really is technology when you really understand it, that we have more power to learn how to tune our own vibrations than we think.
You mentioned that heart awakening moment, and it felt as if that was a seminal moment, maybe of a conscious sort of knowledge, inner wisdom.
Yeah, it was, but I'd have to give you a little bit more of that story. And I'm actually hearing this from more and more people these days. But when I was my first childhood memory, when you could think back to what's your earliest memory that you can remember as a conscious memory, was actually it was I grew up on a small farm in north part of Missouri, actually. And the thing you do is you take your kids to church, of course, and so I have this memory of me sitting there with my little feet hanging over this hard wooden pews on a hot summer day, and the preacher was doing some, I don't know, hell and brimstone, vengeful God sermon. I don't remember the details. And had a download at that point from, I now understand my own larger self, right? As kids, young kids, we tend to have more of that connection. I now understand. But anyway, it was, I'm sitting there looking around and going, no, this is not the way it is. Not the way the world works. And and actually looking around and going, you're big people and you're buying this nonsense, right? So a lot came along with that, that I was kind of here on a mission and a life's mission to do and so on, which I didn't fully know what was, but just knew there was something. So that was really the first journey. And that was profound because it kept me out of settling down, getting married, any of that kind of things and young, because I knew I was something I was supposed to do, which I didn't know what it was. So it was in that story I started the other story with that all became clear as to what that was. So it was really being raised, facilitated actually into really connecting with my own larger self, and which is via the heart. And hard to, it's impossible to describe inner experiences if you don't have them.
I'm curious about this word you used, multidimensional, and that's how you said something along the lines of, that's how it really is if you want to get into it. Could you describe on a more technical level, what do you mean that we're multidimensional beings?
Well, okay, so well, maybe a good way to answer that would be the work of Mae-Wan. I don't know if you've ever heard of her, but she was passed away at too young of an age, but was a biologist in the UK. She wrote a bunch of books, but it was the first to demonstrate quantum coherence in living systems, and actually demonstrated that if you think about a living system, that all of the things that have to come into coherence to exist. She actually defined the difference between living and non-living as quantum coherence, actually, in her books, but from a very, very scientific perspective. And so she shows that you have to have coherence across 2/3 of the known 73 octaves of the electromagnetic spectrum to be a living system. I don't know if I'm making sense. It's kind of a complex answer. I could probably do it simpler, but if you think about it, you've got something has to spin up from nothing to something to have a particle, and a particle forms together to make molecules, and molecules to make, cells, and then organs that have to, work together, right? To even be a cell, let alone a, human or an animal living being. So that's things are working together across scales and across time in a stable way. So there has to be something that glues that together and gives the informational patterns for that, right? Which is ultimately at a more energetic or vibrational level. I don't know if that makes sense to you or not.
Sure, sure. And you said though that the things that are happening at that energetic level are actually informing the physical, as I understood it.
Right.
Do we have a way of, or have you done research that can, in a sense, validate this or demonstrate this in scientific language? And
that's not really our focus so much. We're really more about the heart, but there are people who are doing that. A guy who's doing fantastic research showing that in embryos, right? If you manipulate the field, you can completely change the dynamics of how that embryo forms. So this kind of relates to, his name will come. I'm embarrassed. I can't think of his name right now. I don't know, just intuitively here. There's another thing that happens more related to the heart. It's called acardiac monsters. You've probably never heard of this, but a meaning not, like arrhythmia means not rhythmic, right? So non-cardiac. So for most, I'll give you the short version of this. When a woman becomes pregnant, a very high percentage of those pregnancies spontaneously abort. Then women never know she was pregnant. Now, what determines that in this case is if when the cells are dividing in a what's not yet a fetus, but you got this glob of cells, right? And then the heart's the first signal to be detected in the fetus long before a brain forms, right? It actually becomes the neurons in the heart, and you get this first detectable heartbeat, a pulsing heartbeat in these cells. So if that doesn't happen, that's when you spontaneously abort. There are some cases, and it's one in like every 500,000 or something like that pregnancy. So it's not common, but it's actually well known if you look into it, where that heartbeat doesn't occur, but you don't abort, and the cells continue to grow and multiply. So you end up with what's why it's called an acardiac monster. It's not a living thing, right? You've got an arm sticking out on one side and an eye over here, and you finally abort it. And the point of that is, I actually learned this from, well, it doesn't matter who I learned it from, but that without that field effect, the guiding field of the heart, you don't have the information to guide differentiation and become a living system. Be kind of one example of what I'm talking about.
So we're looking there at a kind of field first model, which is how we might talk about it, field dynamics with what we do, where the body is sort of mapping onto the field that's already present. Yeah, beautiful. Moving things slightly to HeartMath and what you've been doing there. HeartMath is emphasizing this connection between the heart and brain. And I wonder if you could explain a little bit behind the heart-brain coherence and its significance.
Yeah. Okay. And I can answer this on two levels, at least two. Well, we'll start with two. And so if we just keep it at the physiology level, right, then this would be kind of more I'd talk about if I'm at a cardiology conference or something, right, is the heart and brain are more interconnected through the nervous system than any other systems in our body. It's I don't think that far down the road, the future to kind of looking at brain activity without taking the heart into consideration would be considered absurd, right? Which is like the way it's done now. You get rid of all this hard stuff, right? It's an artifact, Well, no, it's not. It's so in reality, the heart sends far more information to the brain than the brain sends to the heart. And this has actually been known since the late 1800s. There's nothing new here. And in fact, William James, considered the founder of psychology, was well aware of this. And psychology was based on this understanding until the 1920s and 30s in there. Anyway, so around late 70s, early 80s, through the 80s, a particular research group really, it was kind of, you could, looking at the history of this, is where the paradigm started shifting back to a more holistic and understandable, accurate perception. When they found that, first of all, at that time, the nervous system was considered this dumb thing, right? Just wires that are there for the brain to tell the body what to do, and all the organs and stuff. Well, they started seeing that that's not the way it worked, that the heart in particular had its own logic and didn't obey the signals from the brain in many contexts. So that was just not supposed to happen right at that time. And in fact, in their writings of that era, they were actually using words in their scientific papers, right? Like the heart acts like it has a mind of its own. Well, and not only that, the signals that the heart was sending to the brain obeyed, and it was affecting perception and many things. So that it was quite the upsetting thing when they were publishing this stuff at that time. But they ended up being proven right, and all that. So that's kind of created a paradigm shift. So the signals that, which is really reflected in the HRV I talked about earlier, the heart rhythms. We took many years, but we now know all the pathways and mechanisms of this. So they introduced two terms back then in that era. The one was called cortical inhibition, cortex, right, being inhibited, the part of our brain we get paid to go to work for, or cortical facilitation. And not only that, they actually showed in their data, although they didn't emphasize this, that the heart somehow knew ahead of time what the brain needed to do next and would either facilitate or reject certain types of perceptual information to facilitate, or navigating the world. So anyway, when you get into we later introduced the language of incoherent and coherent and incoherent heart rhythms, which are very much associated with emotional states, right? We get angry, frustrated, impatient, right? Anxious, fearful, these types of emotions. That leads to more incoherent or disordered rhythms of the heart. That in turn then goes to, so we have all this afferent or ascending information through the nervous system, right? Comes up to really every major brain center, actually. There's direct neural pathways that we now know. One, I'll talk about two real quickly here. One is the thalamus, the very core of our brain, and the thalamus has a lot of roles: sensory distribution, sensory information distribution, and so on. But it's also the center that synchronizes globally neural activity in the brain. And so you have to have good neural synchronization for information to flow through, all the sensory systems and be accurately perceived. So when you're in that incoherent state, it basically interferes with or inhibits neural synchronization globally within the brain. So it affects everything, sensory motor integration, reaction times, but especially the frontal areas of the brain, frontal cortex, prefrontal cortex, and so on. And one of the primary things that gives us as humans is the capacity of foresight. That's what the frontal cortex really is about. So understanding how our behaviors and actions in the now are going to affect the future. That's unique to us as humans. Our beloved pets, they have great memory of the past, hindsight, but they don't necessarily have foresight. Right? So those neural systems and structures to perform optimally have to be well synchronized, the neural activity. So when we're in that incoherent state, they get more or less taken offline, right? So you get angry. Not that any of you have ever done this, right? You get emotionally upset, get a little maybe pissed off at someone, and you blurt out the thing that a minute later you're going, oh my God, I can't believe I just said that. I didn't really even mean it, right? Cortical inhibition. Where if you're in a coherent rhythm, that does the opposite. It facilitates global neural synchronization, right? So everything becomes easier and better. You make better decisions, better choices, right? You don't do the stupid thing, right, when you're angry or upset, as often anyway. And then the other relevant system in the neural structures are the amygdalas, which is our emotional centers. And so in fact, the core cells in the amygdalas are synchronized to the heart. Every time the heart beats, the core nucleus of the amygdala fires in unison with it. So whatever that heart rhythm pattern is directly going to the amygdalas, right? So why do we say to someone when you fall in love, I love you with all my brain? Well, we don't, right? I love you with all of my heart, because we intuitively know there's something about the heart that's involved in emotion. So the amygdalas are really largely monitoring the rhythms of the heart and then comparing that to what's called a familiar baseline reference. And is it familiar or not familiar? And then the higher level brain structures are basically monitoring and labeling that. Now, there's a whole sub-story there, but that's important in terms of psychology. But so that's all physiological level stuff, right? So that's why our HeartMath stuff is so popular with athletes, professional athletes, Olympians, and also things like first responder communities. Because when you get coherent, right, you're able to maintain your composure and your balance in the middle of chaos, right? Or you're able to improve things like sensory motor integration, reaction times, coordination, these type of things, endurance, so on. There's a lot of physiological level. I mean, we could spend a whole hour talking about that, but so now that's keeping it just on the physiological level, right? And the heart actually does have, by the way, what became later understood. We talked about the heart having a mind of its own. Well, the field of neurocardiology was starting right around the same time. Well, it was really becoming more well known in the 90s as well, and which we now know the heart actually does have its own brain. It's called the intrinsic cardiac nervous system. And it was actually one of the leaders of the neurocardiology community that coined the term heart brain. That wasn't us. That was Dr. Armour. So that kind of gives that all a better understanding. However, so if we pin it on the audience, but so one of the things we hear still to this day, but kept hearing from so many people that were practicing the coherence techniques, once we understood the physiology, then we developed a bunch of what are now known as the HeartMath tool set or techniques that allow you to shift into coherence at any time, anywhere, right? Well, what people keep saying is that, God, after I'm practicing this stuff for a while, my intuition's on steroids. It's like, this is different, right? And then usually the second thing is, and synchronicities are become a way of life now. Okay, well, I already knew that. I mean, that's common. And so we did a series, figured out how to do some experiments, very rigorous lab-based research that was published. It's called the Electrophysiology of Intuition, those first papers, where, well, I'm trying to decide how much detail to go into here. But I'm just going to tell you the results, not all the detail, because that's all published. People don't want that to take too much time. Basically, what we found in a paradigm where a person's at a computer and they're going to see images in the future that are either really negative or kind of very calm, and bunny rabbits and nature scenes or snakes striking into the screen, things like that. That before the person sees the picture, that the heart gets the information first about the future, sends a measurably different signal to the brain. So we can actually trace this sending information. It's a technique called heartbeat evoked potentials, where it goes, when and where it goes, and how it travels through the brain. So heart first, then brain, then you get a body response. So we call it the gut feeling, right? Or the hair on the back of the neck. So it's really heart first, then brain, then body. And then you have that feeling if you're paying attention, right, to your inner emotions and perception feelings. So the way I got that published back then, this is like late 90s, somewhere in there, in peer-reviewed scientific journals, right, which is was to say that the heart appears to have access to a field of information outside of time and space. Okay, perfectly acceptable language back then, because entanglement and the stuff had been proven, but not at wet, hot, busy organs like hearts. But that's all changed now, and even in quantum physics. But so that was really code, because that's how you could get it published. But what's a field of information outside the boundaries of time and space? well, I would suggest a little more out of the box these days that you can, well, a lot of people would call it your higher self. Here at HeartMath, we just tend to call it your larger self to take it out of New Age or religion, because we mean this literally. And that's that part, another, to go back to multidimensional beings, right? That's that vibrational or energetic part of our wholeness. It's us, our larger self. And then you can call it, your spirit, your soul, the God within, whatever you want to call it, depending upon what culture and belief system that you come from. So what I'm really suggesting here, I'll say suggesting, but is that the way we're really wired energetically is that we have the physical heart, but we also have an energetic heart, or it's also been called spiritual heart in a lot of traditions for thousands of years. I'm saying that's real. It's not a metaphor. The energetic heart exists. It's very complex and exists at the vibrational level, another dimension. So it acts as the bridge between, our human structure, mind, brain, all that stuff, and our larger self, right? It is that transformer of that from the purely higher vibrational existence into the physical human form here on Earth. Right? So we all have one. And when we get into a more coherent state, and this is actually what the research data proved, was that opens that channel between the heart and brain. So we get more intuitive information, but it's intuitive information. The source of that intuitive information in this context is from our own larger self, right? So that's accessing that is how we start getting in touch with and unfolding who we really are, right? And what our real purpose is. And then that also then starts allowing us to become more self-regulated from that perspective, so it can finally bring the mind and emotions into alignment with, the larger part of ourself.
A brief pause to thank you for listening to this episode. If you're looking to take the next step in your transformation, find out how we can support you with our popular energy healing training, one-to-one private sessions, free resources, and more. Visit energyfielddynamics.com to learn more. When we say energy here, are we talking about something that is like that does have form, something like an electromagnetic field? I believe, we see like pictures of the tube torus or toroidal fields, for instance, or what traditionally might have been called the aura. Right? Are we talking about that connection between a physical and non-physical aspect?
No, not exactly. So when you see the torus shape, for example, around that the heart produces, or the toroidal shape of the magnetic field of the Earth, or they look the same. Okay. So when we put electrodes on the body, across the chest to measure the electrocardiogram, or we stick them on the head to measure the electroencephalograph, right? It's called electrode because we're literally measuring electricity, right? So the electrodes, what they measure, they're differential amplifiers basically, are measuring current flow. They're measuring the electrical signal, right? But whenever you have a flow of electrical current, I mean, this is kind of physics 101, you create a magnetic field, right? Back to my original thing. I mean, that's what's called electromagnetism. But electric and magnetic fields are very different things. And you can make one out of the other, right? The flow of current makes a magnetic field, or you can have a moving magnetic field and induce current flow, right? So the electrodes don't see the magnetic component, that's produced by the flow, the electrical flow of the beating heart or neural activity in the brain. So the magnetic field that's produced when the heart beats easily radiates outside the body. That's what's different. Magnetic fields go through things, right? This is why cell phones work indoors. It's just what I used to do professionally as a communication engineer. So if you don't believe me, stop using your cell phone indoors, right? I mean, we know they work. You can even be in an elevator. So it's a magnetic field that's going through the windows and the walls and so on, and carrying the information, your voice, text message, whatever, right? So pretty much any technology from my world perspective that we've invented, nature beat us to it. We're really just understanding how things already work. So we work the same way in that the field that we radiate. So you can, so to measure that magnetic component, the electrodes don't see that. You need a different instrument. And it's called a magnetometer, right? So you can, then most larger hospitals have what are called MCGs, magnetocardiograms. You don't have to touch the body to measure the field, right? So obviously you would put the sensor fairly close because you get a good signal to noise ratio, but you can back up at the magnetic sensor from the body a number of feet before you lose the capacity to detect the heart signal. That's about an inch from the brain, right? So the heart, the magnetic component of the heart is 100 times greater than the brain. So it's obviously, when we're talking energetically, right, magnetically in this case, the heart's the big player. And for sure, it's carrying emotional state information. I mean, we can put a probe out here in front of a person and measure the magnetic field, and then look at the informational patterns being carried by that field and tell with about 75% accuracy, somewhere in that range, what somebody's emotional state is, what they're actually feeling. Right. So what this means is that what we feel inside doesn't stop at the skin. We are literally broadcasting, radiating that information. And then, so again, this is back to 90s for us. A lot of fun stuff we were doing back then. The next step in that research was to ask the question, well, okay, that's cool, but are we also receivers of the information from other people? And so basically, I look at it like our nervous system is a big antenna that is tuned to other biologically generated fields, like a window effect. That ties back into another guy's work named Ross Adey, who showed that biological responses to magnetic fields have windows, and they're you have to be the right frequency and the right amplitude for us to respond to them, which those windows happen to be the same as what we generate, by the way. So what this means is that, so in other words, the fields that we radiate are detected by other people's nervous systems in a measurable way. I mean, our nervous systems respond in measurable ways to detect and respond to those fields, the information being carried by those fields from other people. So what this shows us is that there is of course, there's body language, tones of voice, and how we all read emotions from other people, facial expression, so on. But there's also an energetic communication that's always going on between people, and that in some cases is more important than even these other factors in terms of our perceptions of others, right? And it's a very big factor in misperception, in misunderstanding of, like you might be feeling one thing and saying something else that doesn't match. Well, we detect that, and it's like, I don't trust that person, right? You don't know why, but that kind of thing, or it feels really good to be around others. So I know that's a long answer again, Keith, but in other words, this is not the same as the energetic heart. This is all physiologically measurable, produced and measured stuff at this kind of level.
So I'm curious to take that a step forward. And you said that earlier about things that are outside of time and space, information propagated beyond time and space. So does that mean that the emotional states and the transference of this information between people is happening without the limitation of distance, for instance?
Well, in the case I just described, no, right? This would be like in the living room if we measure this. Now, however, so this gets into a whole other can of worms in a way. So we can measure this stuff in the lab that I just described, and we can put barriers between people and that aren't shielded and still see this information flow and physiological responses. Okay. So that's pretty cool when you think about it. It describes a lot of our everyday experience. You have one of those meetings, and you walk away going, God, the tension was so thick you could have cut it with a knife in there, right? I mean, we all experience these things, or how good it feels to be around others. So that kind of explains that. However, in fact, we just had a study published last week in one of the Nature journals, scientific reports. Let's see, do I want to get into this? Well, basically, I'll tell you the essence. It shows that in groups, at the group level, when people like each other, there's a positive emotional connection amongst the members of a group, that their heart's rhythms can be synchronized over long time periods, 2 weeks in this case, non-locally, right? So there's also a non-local component that you can't explain by just the magnetics that we were talking about earlier. So they're, again, multidimensional, right? There's different levels of connection. That also takes us into some of the global work we're doing as well in terms of humanity's connection with and influence, bidirectional influence with the Earth's magnetic fields.
I love what we're talking about here, Rollin, because we're thinking that there's so much concept of information and energy exchange between individuals that's central to like what we might call more Eastern healing arts, right? And then this acceptance in Western medicine is completely challenged by the lack of like mechanism to explain how this energy information or exchange is communicated. So what you're describing here or speaking of is a electromagnetic, I believe, interactions within and between people. So I think we're looking at like psychological linkage and empathy and all sorts of explanations. And it's getting into really exciting territory around things such as distance healing work, or even for those who are particularly energetically sensitive, we're starting to get mechanisms beyond the word empath or sensitive into actually that this phenomena is happening irregardless of somebody's sensitivity to it. Huge, vast implications for what we are as individuals and as collective humanity.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. In fact, the study we just published, in a pretty high-level journal, right? One of the reviewers didn't believe it. Don't confuse me with the data. My mind's made up. It took a few rounds to, finally couldn't argue with the data. But the fact that, well, this is a study of physiological synchronization, as you're talking about. But which is a really relatively new field, really looking at whether it's EEG or brainwave synchronization or heart rhythm synchronization, these types of things. They're typically small studies of 2 people at a time, because it's very hard to get time synchronized data from multiple people. And they're almost always, I'd say 99% of the studies that are published, there's it's a field that's just beginning, but there's already hundreds of studies out there on this, and that are mostly in the relatively new. But they're almost always a study where you do something to try and induce synchronization. So you look at maybe an audience listening to the same music at the same time, an orchestra or something, or a couple of individuals trying to solve a puzzle together, or during communication, things like this. And you see, the studies are pretty cool because they already show that the degree of physiological synchronization between individuals is very much related to prosocial behaviors and acceptance and listening and performance, on tasks and things. So it's pretty fundamental to, it's kind of woven into our social connection in a way, that there is this physiological synchronization. The study we just did, we had, give you a little context, we looked at, it was part of a much larger study where we had 5 groups of 20 people in each group, and they're located around the world. So the one group was in, see if I could remember them all, Saudi Arabia, Lithuania, New Zealand, California, and the UK. Okay, so it was another pretty cool study, but this is another analysis. So we were looking at, in this case, this analysis of that data, I would think of it as free running synchronization. They're not doing anything. The only thing in common is that we're part of a group in those countries. So they're going about their normal days for over a 2-week period while we're monitoring their heart rate variability continuously for 24 hours a day for 15 days. And when we looked at how in sync were they with their heart rhythms, 2 of the 5 groups were synchronized. That to begin with is phenomenal. Who would have ever thought that's possible, right? The 2 groups that had the high degree of the actual synchronization were the 2 groups with a high degree of social interconnections. They liked each other. They knew each other, liked each other, prayed together, worked together, stuff like that. But it's not like they're hanging out in the same room for 15 days. No, they were all going about their normal lives. The 3 groups that you didn't have that. There was a lot of people didn't know each other, that kind of thing. So really, what this implies is that whether it's a family, a leadership team, a nursing team, whatever, to people who work together, who like each other and have positive connections, emotional connections, form a group level field that is a non-local, where they are non-locally interconnected, where you're sharing information with the group members that are part of that field, non-locally, which makes a lot of sense. And this isn't the only kind of data sets that support what I'm saying here, that we form these group fields where we share energy and information amongst the group members, right? If you see like a really championship sports team, right, that just somehow magically seems to know where each other is and what they're all doing at the same time, right? Or an orchestra or a band or whatever that just sometimes they hit that just it's just different, the level of the performance where they're just in sync and in tune together.
As you say, the synchronization, I'm thinking of when you see those like a flock of birds who are moving very fast, and they're basically functioning in a group mind. And we might not fully understand the mechanism behind it, but obviously we can just apply that or extrapolate it to different aspects of human experience and see how synchronized that we can be. I mean, we're working in energy healing work, Christabel and I, with groups of people, and we see what it means to work with energy and information across distance, and how transformative that kind of work can be with people. But the mechanism is not fully understood, obviously, by in scientific language in a way that's comfortable yet. But it seems like things are changing.
Yeah, we I'm sure you probably find, I would guess, that the healing arts and processes work better when there's a group involved rather than an individual, because there is a collect. If you're in sync, right, energy, and it can be energetically in sync, not necessarily they have to be everybody's heart rhythms are synchronized, but energetically in sync, that you have a bigger or a higher ratio of effectiveness in the healing process. And I'm sure Joe Dispenza and his work, and Joe's been I've known Joe before he was famous. But anyway, we've been doing, we published also, I think it was this year or maybe last year, that we were looking at doing HRV. So we did a number of groups where we measured the HRV of the healers and the healee during these healing circles. And we have a pretty strong partnership, or collaboration really, with a couple groups at the University of Lithuania. And one of the groups is the mathematics group. And we basically had to invent some new mathematical approaches to how do we get at energetic level synchronization, even though it may not show up physiologically. So we published a paper last year on that work. Showing how the synchronization was occurring it was using a nonlinear approach in the healers and the healees in these healings.
It builds upon an understanding that is emerging, and you're right in the heart, dare I use the pun, of this research and emergence in our understanding, because with the work we do, we're not on the science side of things. We see the immense potential that these insights have for changing humanity, changing the collective, changing our perspective on who we are, how we're connected, and how that might apply both to a self-understanding, philosophically, experientially, but also literally at a very application level as well, like technology and health and well-being.
Yeah, I mean, there's, for example, we have a number of apps we've developed that measure a person's level of heart coherence. And from my perspective, it's actually higher dimensional technology made simple, right? Because it allows people to see and experience their own level of coherence and experiment and see, when I feel this, I'm incoherent. When I feel love, one of the vibrations of love, whether that's compassion or kindness or gratitude or patience, acceptance, these types of things, that takes them into a more coherent rhythm. That's, I can't necessarily prove this yet, but I would, pretty good hints that at the energetic heart level, that's in communication with all the DNA. DNA, from my world, is an antenna as well that's connected with our energetic heart, right? I mean, yeah, you've got the DNA information about what your eye color is going to be, and you're going to be a boy or a girl. hair color and all that. But, one of the big surprises of mapping the human genome was, where's all the missing information? I don't know if you remember all that or not. It was a big shock that there's not enough, not even close to enough information in DNA to explain a living system. Well, where's the missing information? Well, so I'm suggesting that's energetic heart is where that is. And the DNA is really an antenna, right? And when I say energetic level changes, well, that's communicating with the cells and the DNA. So any real healing has to be at that level, right? Otherwise, it just pops out somewhere else, because we have our own, so it's not about finding what's bad, right, or we did wrong, but it really becomes more about removing the energetic blocks in that communication system between our larger self and the energetic heart and human expression of that.
With what you're sharing here and just sort of absorbing the information, there's a very beautiful but poignant sense of responsibility that comes into this once we're getting clear as individuals, as a collective, maybe hopefully as a society, on the implications of this level of research in terms of I used an amazing term earlier, I loved it because it implies volition, which is our emotional diet, right? What is it we're consuming, but what is it we're also kind of excreting into the world, right? What is it that we're putting out there? And maybe this sort of stems into a sort of final question here around practicalities, and this could be some of HeartMath's offerings as well, but what is it that people can do from your perspective? How is it that with this information, they can start moving towards something that looks like this level of coherence you describe?
Well, that's a very long discussion, but I have to say, first step is becoming more self-aware and self-awareness has got levels and layers. It kind of starts with what mindfulness would talk about, becoming more aware of thoughts and emotions and that kind of thing. But there's, with some practice, yeah, of course you've got to become aware of that, but that's kind of 101. But then becoming more aware of the vibrational part of our wholeness and our nature, because it's a lot easier to turn around, say a lower vibrational frequency at that level than it is once it gets down into the physiology. You still can, but it just takes a lot more energy and a lot more work. Kind of like a train that's left the tracks. It's a lot, that energy is harder to turn around than getting it when it's subtler. And so I kind of think of it as, I might have hinted at this earlier, the vibrational spectrum of love. So if you think of emotions as vibrations at the energetic level, right, within the love spectrum, and you could use a musical spectrum as a metaphor, an octave for what I'm saying here, but that contains things like compassion and acceptance and heart vulnerability, patience, higher dignity. That part of our exists at that higher vibrational level. Peace and acceptance, these types of things. Then you've got the lower vibrational emotions. And I'm not saying good, bad. I'm just saying they're vibrations. And, so the things that, judgments and anger, hate, impatience, these are all lower vibrations that have real manifestations in our physiology for our health and well-being, right? But they're also the lower vibration at that level block our connection with our larger self. Right. So because at the higher, when our consciousness evolves, because we're really on a journey in the evolution of consciousness, we all individually have our own level, and from my perspective, we go through many lifetimes. You come to Earth to learn about this level of density and navigate through it. So when we're able to really shift what I'll call the baseline frequency of our consciousness and awareness into the higher vibrations, that's when we truly become more co-creators of our reality. And so it's a little bit wider, but what I'm talking about now, but there's a built-in safety mechanism in a way in this dimension. Because if you can imagine if what we imagine in the quality of our consciousness could actually interact with and change physical reality, which it can. That's what our global consciousness projects are really all about demonstrating. If you were able to have things like hate and frustration and anger manifest in reality, it's already a mess, what the world would be like, right? If you really had that power of co-creation and creation. But you can't, you just have to, but there's an eye of the needle to get into that next octave of vibration, of conscious vibration, that judgments and blame and those lower vibrations can't get through to really get into that level of where we're really true co-creating our shared reality.
Is the heart the eye which the thread must go through?
Yes, you could look at it that way, but it's really more energetic and vibrational. That is what it is, right? There's no faking that. And that's why we have to do the work.
So where is it that people can find you and your work? Where would you point them to? And yeah, anything coming up that you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, our website, heartmath.org, not .com, for the research. And there's a research library if people want the research. There's hundreds of free papers or papers you can download there that have been published and organized by category. We also have an event. We do an annual global coherence event that's really more about our global work. And that's very practical and really cool event. That's in April here, and it'll be held in Santa Cruz. That'll be great for people who want a first-hand experience. Got some great speakers that'll be there in addition to some of the HeartMath people, myself, and some others like that are pretty cool folks.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll make sure all that information is included in the show notes, Rollin, and it's truly been a pleasure to connect and just to hear you share a little of your accrued wisdom from over the years. So many thanks.
Thanks for being a part of the Future of Wellness. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review. It helps us reach more people and to make great episodes like this one. Learn more about field dynamics and why we think the future of wellness matters. Check us out at energyfielddynamics.com. See you next time.